Hello there. Going through a divorce? Considering one? Sorry to hear that, but here you are. Welcome to Splitsville. You'll find Splitsville to be a pretty unique place. A new world, really, with its own rules, its own expectations, and in many ways, its own language. But don't worry, you have a knowledgeable guide along the way. And now, here she is.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to Splitsville. We are here with Dr. Tracy Masiello to talk about resist-refuse dynamics versus parental alienation. I'm Sheila Passanant. I'm a family law attorney and a parent coordinator and a mediator at Touchstone Family Law. And I've had a lot of experience working with children in the court system and high conflict custody cases. And I've known Dr. Masiello for many, many years. We've had many cases together. And here at Touchstone Family Law, we got a lot of questions from our clients or future clients or parents in the community about this resist-refuse dynamics. Why does my child not want to visit? What's going on? And before we go any further, let me tell you how amazing Dr. Masiello is. She is a psychologist, a licensed clinical mental health counselor, supervisor, parenting coordinator, divorce coach, and a divorce mediator. She is the founder and owner of the group practice Reaching Resolution, which provides mental health services for children through adults. She specializes in court-involved therapy, family reunification work, and high conflict family systems. She is an amazing resource that we've used and taken advantage of for many, many years. So today, Tracy, if you could, we do get a lot of questions. Why won't my child visit? What's going on? Can you kind of talk us through what could be going on and how you assess that when a family comes to you?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited to be here and be able to talk about this with you. So let's start by just really talking about what we mean when we talk about resist-refuse dynamics. A lot of times clients come to me, I'm sure they come to you, where they're talking about this notion of parental alienation, right? A child doesn't want to see them or resists going to see them. And so, the parent comes to us and it's like, obviously the other parent must be saying something or turning them against me. So we hear this term used a lot. When we're talking about parental alienation, what we're really talking about are situations where one parent is actively and intentionally undermining the child's relationship with that other parent. So it could be things like doing bad mouthing, right? Or limiting contact, or just saying things or behaving in ways that create fear and a loyalty conflict for a child, right? Because if, let's say, they're with mom and mom is saying negative things about dad, and talking about dad as being an unsafe person, then that child might resist going with the parent out of fear that something could happen to them, but also a sense of wanting to protect and stay loyal to mom. So we see this situation where then when kids do that, they feel guilty because now they're rejecting dad, and maybe dad hasn't done anything to them directly. So it's a no-win situation for a child when that happens.
Is there ever something that causes, like when you're meeting with a family trying to tease out what's going on, is there ever something that has happened that's causing the child to not want to visit? And how do you figure that one out?
Absolutely. Sometimes we put that more into what we call the resist or refuse dynamic. So that's a more accurate term that just describes a pattern where a child is resisting or refusing contact. In that case, we don't always know the cause, but sometimes when we see this, it's not that the other parent is intentionally, right, and actively trying to undermine the relationship between a parent and a child, but instead it's that something has happened to that child, right? Maybe they did have, a traumatic experience with that parent, or maybe that parent didn't do something that, arises to the level of trauma like abuse or neglect, but that parent just did something that maybe wasn't just great parenting, right? Maybe they, just were harsh with them, overly punished them for something. They did something like a small infraction and they gave them a bigger punishment. Maybe they have said things about the other parent that's really upset the child. So there might be things that they did that we would call, we'd consider like not great parenting, but not necessarily things that rise to that level of true abuse or neglect. So there's really that range, right, of everything from a child who has been alienated, nothing's happened with them and the parent, but the other parent has actively undermined that relationship, to the child who doesn't want to see that parent because they have true fears, right? They've had a traumatic experience. Maybe they have been abused or neglected by that parent. And then, of course, we have everything kind of in that middle range.
What is the difference? How does a child who you think, with that first example, the parental alienation, Talk about that phrase. It gets thrown around a lot, and some people say parental alienation syndrome. Is that real? What is that? Can you kind of explain this to everyone in just plain language?
Yes, parental alienation was initially called a syndrome. It was this idea that it was some presenting issue that children had and that a family had. There is not any such thing. It's not a DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of mental health disorders. It's not a diagnosis that you would find in that, right? It's not one that we use in counseling. It's not one we use in psychology. So there's not a syndrome. But again, there is the term parental alienation that gets used a lot whenever a parent worries that the other parent is undermining their relationship with the child. And so we really want to reserve that for those true cases where a parent is actively, right, and intentionally trying to keep that child from the parent, right, trying to disrupt that relationship. There's lots of reasons why, parents might do that. We have too many to go into in the time that we have for this podcast episode. But when it does happen, you will see things like a parent, will tell children directly things which, instill fear. They will encourage children to call the other parent by their first name instead of, by mom or dad. They will actively engage in certain behaviors that ultimately result in a child not wanting to be with that parent. And that's a very small subset of what we typically see in most of these cases where children resist or refuse to go to a parent. It does happen, but it's more the exception than the rule. So what we do see, though, more commonly when a child is resisting or refusing seeing another parent is a lot of other types of contributing factors. So, for example, there could be maybe some past conflict between that child and that parent, or like I said before, some harsh discipline from that parent that the child is resisting spending time with. Sometimes it's just exposure to ongoing parental conflict. Mom and dad are fighting constantly, sometimes about the child's grades or their activities after school or vacation time or whatever. And the child feels really in the middle of that. And so to remove themselves from having to deal with that back and forth and that constant conflict, they just pick a side. And then they just want to be with that parent so that they can try to eliminate, right, and manage that conflict just so they have peace. Sometimes we see this, where there are mental health issues that a child can have or one of the parents has that could be a contributing factor. Sometimes it's just, communication breakdowns. And we do see cases sometimes where it's just differences in parenting style, right? We call this a parent-child fit. If you have a child who is, very much an introvert, very studious, wants to stay home, and that's their happy place is being at home and, and studying and reading and that type of thing. And you have a parent who's an extrovert and they want to spend their parenting time going out and seeing people and doing things where they're really pushing the child to play sports. You might see in that case where a child resists spending time with them, especially if the other parent is the one that lets them be that homebody, right? That really supports and encourages, their interests and activities. So sometimes it's just a disconnect that happens. And when you have an intact family, you might have that still happen, but because everybody's in the home, you have that balance, right? You have the parent who is pushing the child to go out and try some things. And you have the parent who, is right there, willing to sit and play cards or hang out at home. When there's conflict between the parent and there's disruption and the children kind of feel like they have a choice, what you see is children who will want to stay with that parent that's the better fit, right? And, that really resist being with that other parent, spending time with them. So there's a lot of reasons why children resist and refuse time with a parent that has nothing to do with the other parent actively undermining that relationship.
So I guess that would lead me to the next question, which is, what do you do? How do you help heal that relationship or foster that relationship with the targeted parent or not that? So you have a favored parent and a targeted parent. And how do you fix that or work with that?
Right. I think really you have to start by figuring out what's going on, right? What is it that's happening that's the root cause? Sometimes it's fear. The child is afraid of that parent. Sometimes just confusion. They don't know which end is up and what they want to do and where they want to be. And sometimes, like I said, they're just emotionally exhausted, right? So, we really want to figure out what is the why behind the child's resistance, right? Because that's going to help us then figure out what's going to be the right support. Okay. And so again, sometimes, we see things when we start looking at causes and we dig in a little bit deeper, we can see things like a parent unintentionally sending a mixed message, right? Or negative cues about the other parent. Sometimes a parent's not actively trying to badmouth the other parent or intentionally doing it. But, let's say the one parent sends them a text about, a bill that they need to pay, right? And they have to pay their half. And the parent gets the text. They're like, they sigh when they see it, or they kind of roll their eyes. The child sees that, right? And that message that the child internalizes from that is, oh, it's bad when, when this parent A, texts parent B. They might not know the content of that text, but they see that reaction. So sometimes, we have to figure out, is that what's happening, where there really wasn't an issue, but by what the child observed that parent doing, their interpretation of it has now made them feel uncertain about that parent or anxious about being with that parent. So we need to figure out things like that, right? Or if they just are feeling pressured to choose. Once we do that, then we do have the ability to improve a situation. But it really is going to take a coordinated approach, right? So it's not like one parent blaming the other. There's not a quick fix, especially if it's been a while since a child has spent time with a parent. I see cases sometimes where it's been years that a child has not had contact with a parent. And so, you're not going to just sit down with the child, have a session and be like, hey, parent A is safe, let's go. So we really have to do some very specific types of interventions. So one is really psychoeducation for the parents, right? Really helping both parents understand these resist-refuse dynamics, right? And the impact that their conflict has on their children. And then talking about, healthy ways to support that rebuilding of trust, right? That rebuilding of the relationship between the targeted parent, right, and the child. And the preferred parent does have a role in helping make that happen, right, as kind of the safe place for that child. So that is one of the, the places that we like to start. Sometimes, like I said, parents don't know that they are creating or helping to create the situation, right? That their behaviors or their words has a contribution to the child not going, right? Again, they're not actively or intentionally doing anything, but what's happening is the cause. So when we realize that, sometimes just educating that parent, they can, course correct those behaviors and help promote that relationship between that parent and that child.
I think the misconception a lot of our clients or, potential clients have is that all that needs to be done is the parent who hasn't seen the child has to work on his or her issues and everything will be okay. And that the other parent is just, kind of fine, doesn't have to do anything. Does that work?
That does not work, right? Because children don't behave in a vacuum, right? There's a lot of some contributing factors. It's usually not just one thing, right? It's oftentimes a combination of things, which has, culminated in that child resisting or refusing to be with that parent. So it really does require both parents, right, working together collaboratively. And I know sometimes when you have a high conflict situation, that's difficult for parents to do. And that's where we recommend, some co-parenting, right? Co-parenting coaching or counseling, some of these other types of activities where you have a professional really helping to facilitate, communication between the two of them, helping them figure out better ways to deal with each other, right? How to handle their emotions better that sometimes get in the way of those big feelings. But really, it does require both parents to play a role, right? The one parent needs to be encouraging, helping the child see that other parent is safe. And then the parent who is the targeted parent does need to, look at what is their contribution. Have they, not been listening to their child or communicating well with them? Are they not respecting their children's boundaries or interests or who their child is? Have they done actual things which are harmful, and taken steps to improve themselves and improve their ability to parent? So it really is looking at both people, right? It's looking at the whole system and then working with the child too. And I really recommend children get their own individual therapy so they have that space to express their feelings, right? To process the fear or the confusion that they have and just really have a chance to rebuild that emotional safety, right? Again, when we're talking about these cases, we're talking about ones where we don't have concerns about the child's physical safety, right? We might have, supports in place for that if that was ever a concern. But what we're talking about usually in these cases is emotional safety, right? Children are afraid of, what's going to happen, what the parent's going to say, how they're going to feel. So we really want children to have that safe place to process all of those feelings, right? And have somebody who can really understand what the child's concerns are and what's underlying their resistance or their refusal to go and spend time with their parent.
So how does it actually work? Like in an actual, give an example of it. A parent calls you and the child's refusing to go and the court has ordered them to try to get the child to go on, even if it's every other weekend and they haven't gone in, 3 months. The child's, let's say, 9-year-old girl refusing to go. No one knows why. What do you do?
So that would be the first thing, right? We do an intake with both parents. Typically we start with the parents, right? We want to get some background, and we do it separately. We most of the time like to have parents together so everybody hears the same thing. Everybody's on the same page. One parent isn't worried that the therapist is aligned with the other parent and having conversations about them behind their back. But we typically start with one intake with each parent separately so they can feel like they can speak freely without worrying that the other parent's going to jump in or disagree or, interject. And we just try to get a sense from either parent about what has gotten us to this place, right, from their perspective. And just some general background about the child, their health, their social, development, their emotional development, how they're doing in school, all of those things. And then we start working with that child, right? First, we just begin by building trust and rapport. Children don't, just like adults, don't really always want to come in to talk to a stranger, just tell us everything. So we do have to start building that relationship and that trust with the child. But then once we have that, depending upon the child's age, we have different ways that we can start to explore and figure out what's happening, what's underlying that resistance, right? And then once we have that information, we can work with the family, right? Working with the parents, working with the child to help address those concerns and help them move forward in a safe space. Now, sometimes we have cases, though, where there really is some very intense disruption, if you will. It's a very significant disruption between a child or maybe even all the children in a family and a parent. And in those cases, we often do what's called reunification family therapy or reunification therapy.
Okay, yeah. And I know a lot of people have heard that phrase. And how is that different from family therapy, for example?
Essentially, family therapy is a broader term, but reunification therapy really is just one type of family therapy. However, the dynamics are different. When other people come, or when people come in typically to your traditional family therapy, if you will, they usually come in, all of them wanting things, wanting to work together and wanting things to be better. A lot of times you can begin very quickly with having everybody in the room together, both parents, the child, the whole family there. And it's a lot of, just validating and supporting and working on communication. If you try to do some of those same techniques when you have these resist-refuse dynamics, especially when you have high conflict between the parents, those same techniques often backfire and make things worse.
How?
So that's why this is very specialized, because the premise is very different, right? The foundation is different. There's not the same trust between a mom and dad in a high conflict divorce situation as there might be in an intact family where they're like, hey, there's something wrong, we're all going to go, right? But the parents are still together, they still communicate, they still have some relationship. A lot of times in these cases, the families don't have a relationship. So trying to use those same techniques that work when everybody's there on the same page just ends up pushing some people away, right? You just can't get people to come to the table in the same way that you can. So it really does take a specialized approach, right? It really does take an approach of getting the parents to the point where they can have conversations and communicate together, teaching them the skills and the tools, right, to be able to communicate effectively with one another. A lot of times they don't, helping to start building some trust there. And then again, in family therapy, typically you very quickly have everybody in the room, you sit down, you figure out what are the issues and you start working on those, with them all together. And this, we really have to take a very different approach. So, sometimes it's just getting a child comfortable being with that parent that they've been resisting seeing. It is not uncommon that, sometimes we can't just have them come into a session together, especially if it's been a long time that they've been apart. We might have to start with them just doing some texts or some email phone calls or something like that. I've had some where the child is so afraid of that other parent and so anxious that I can't even have any interaction with them. So in those cases, I have to do a technique where I basically have the parent, where the child is, if we do it on Zoom, the child's off camera. We do it in my office, their child's behind a one-way mirror observing, and I'm just talking to that parent. I interview that parent. What do they like to do? What's their favorite color? Or what ice cream flavors do they like? Whatever it is, but just so that child can get comfortable in a safe way, seeing this parent, seeing that they're not the devil incarnate, seeing that, that they're just a regular person, right? And just sometimes you really have to start there. So again, it's going to vary depending upon the child and what's going on, which techniques you use, but it really does take some very specific techniques that we don't typically do when we're working in more traditional family therapy in that realm.
And if you were just to go back to where we were with the parental alienation, which you said that's a very small percentage of the cases, how would you approach those cases? How would that be different than just the run-of-the-mill resist refuse? How would you approach those?
That's why we don't do that without a court order.
Okay.
Because, and that's why I always recommend to therapists, if you're doing this work, have a court order, and I would recommend that to families. And that is because what oftentimes happens when there isn't a court order in place is, especially in these situations where one parent is undermining the other, it can feel threatening to that parent for the child to suddenly, be enjoying time with that other parent, right? And having that relationship. And so if you don't have an order that says, you need to have this therapy, follow these recommendations, what can happen is that parent just stops bringing the child to sessions. Or that parent will say, oh, this child might act fine when they're at your office, but then as soon as we leave, they're just a mess, and they have outbursts and disruptions and all these horrible behaviors, and this is harmful, and they just walk away. And the same can happen with the targeted parent, right? They sometimes are very eager. They want to jump right in, especially if they haven't seen their child in a while, right? They're eager to get started and have those joint sessions. And again, there's a timing and a pacing that has to happen, and we have to, wait till the child is emotionally ready, right, emotionally able to handle those interactions before we start doing that. And so a parent might decide, hey, I don't want to wait for that. I want to see my child now, and do what I call therapist shopping, where they start looking around trying to find somebody who will just jump right in. And unfortunately, when they do that, like I said before, it typically backfires. We have lots of cases where kids come and they've had 2 or 3 therapists before they actually come to us.
And with regard to that, so you recommend, with families who are separating, who aren't too high conflict, and they need the child's just refusing to go, the parties just separate, and they don't know what kind of schedule to do, and the child's refusing, they don't need a court order. They can just call and say, hey, we need some help, like coming up with a plan for this child.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, reunification therapy really is going to involve a lot of parts, right? There's like an assessment phase where we just try to understand, right, what's led to that rupture. There's the individual preparation, right? We get both parents ready, we get the child ready, we teach regulation skills. And then again, once we start those joint sessions, they're very carefully facilitated, right? And the therapist is there just really guiding. And then, of course, we do the parent coaching piece where we get both parents aligned. We don't start that in the beginning, but that's more towards the end. And just, try and work throughout it so that neither parent is intentionally or unintentionally, undermining the process. So that's one type of thing. Like I said, it has a very specific way that it needs to be done and to be rolled out. So there's some other options. If parents aren't needing that, they can get, parent coaching, right? Or, they can get, somebody who will sit down with them and basically say, okay, here's a plan, here's what this could look like, and really, can work with them here, to help them improve their communication, help them improve, messaging to the child, and works with them in a different capacity. It's kind of, if you want to say, maybe reunification therapy light. It doesn't quite have the intensity and need all of the authority, behind it to really make it effective. But it uses a lot of the same pieces. It still tries to figure out, what's the issues that are underlying it, where are things going south between the two parents, and then working from there.
And could some of it, in your experience over these years of doing this kind of work, some of it just be that child's age and stage of life? So, you have a 14 or 15-year-old girl, and she's like, I'm not going to dad's anymore. He doesn't, give me the food I like, or he won't let me go to the mall, or, whatever. And she just puts her foot down, like, I'm not going. That's it. So you have that. And then what about like a younger child, the situation where they're just used to being in one place and, they prefer just not moving around. So do you deal with those situations as well?
Absolutely. It's why I always tell parents when they come in and they're like, "Oh, my child doesn't want to see me." It's this big thing. So it's like, "Hey, let's relax. Let's take a breath. Let's take a beat. Let's not jump to conclusions. Let's stay child focused and really just figure out, what's going on, and then how do we address that, right?" And it might be, helping dad hear teen daughter and what kind of food she likes, or helping mom hear teen daughter and what kind of food she likes, and whichever parent it is, and making that happen, right? If it's not something outrageous, right? Just understanding the child developmentally. So sometimes there is that psychoeducation, again, yes, the child who just is comfortable. I see that a lot, especially where people have the parenting time where it's 50-50, but it's like, a couple days here, a couple days there, like
a lot of moving around,
or 2-2, 3, and for some children, they don't, it's great for parents because they get to see them frequently, but for some children, they don't like that because they feel like they're living out of a suitcase, like they can't get settled. Or especially if they have like lots of projects for school and they're trying to remember to bring everything back and forth. And so sometimes it's just practical, right? It's just, when we want to do that, if it was us, right? We like to sometimes be settled in our home too. So it's developmentally appropriate, it's reasonable a lot of times that children feel this way, right? So it's validating that. And then, again, yes, everybody pulling together, both parents, their coach or their therapist, whoever's helping them, just really working together to figure out, okay, how can we tweak some things and make some things work better?
Okay. Well, thank you so very much for all these great tips and for giving our viewers some tools for their toolkit. So, go either whatever stage of separation or divorce, or they've been separated or divorced for years and their kids are refusing. These are some really good tools and education that you can access through Dr. Masiello and some other very well-trained, well-respected therapists that we have in our community. So Thank you very much for your time today.
Absolutely. Again, thank you so much for having me and giving me the chance to talk about this.
Of course. Thank you.
So there you have it. Another neighborhood of Splitsville explored. There's still so much to learn here, so I hope you'll tune in to the next episode. While Splitsville is not a fun place to be, thankfully it is full of helpful people, valuable resources, and sound advice, if you know where to look. See you next time.
The insights and views presented in Welcome to Splitsville are for general information purposes only and should not be taken as legal advice for any individual case or situation. Nor does tuning into this podcast constitute an attorney-client relationship of any kind. If you're ready for compassionate and reliable legal guidance on your journey, contact Lee Sellers and her team at www.touchstonefamilylaw.com.